Zachary Stein, Dr. Zachary Stein, I should say. I wanted to talk to you, for a few reasons. The first thing, that caught my attention was your interest in Ivan Illich, or the fact that you think and write about Ivan Illich a little bit, and that seems to be an influence in your work. And in the 90s, I read Illich, and it kind of changed my world, or it changed how I saw the world, like radically in some sense.
Right.
And so I've been waiting for somebody to come along and talk about the fact that, talk about deschooling society. And like you distinguish between education and schooling.
Right.
And you talk about a kind of infinite, what did you say? An infinite horizon of education or something like that. Right. And then this limitation of schooling that we have, and the fact that we're in between worlds in some sense, whereas we don't know, one mode of living and being seems to be disintegrating, including our education system, and another one seems to be trying to be born with all of this existential threat. So that's kind of my introduction, and why, there's a couple other reasons actually why I'm interested in talking to you. Because another reason was, maybe we can talk about that later, is that you said that you were a dyslexic, a successful dyslexic.
Yeah,
and
I think high achieving.
High achieving, excuse me, high achieving dyslexic, and I think I'm not a high achieving dyslexic, but I think I'm a dyslexic. And,
that's arguable for me too. So. Well, you're a musician. I'm also a musician.
And that was the last thing. That was the last of the three things that I was thinking of, which made me want to talk to you. Now, besides listening to you and noticing that you had a very clear and lucid voice and important things to say. So can you talk about this? Can you talk about Ivan Illich and
sure.
Deschooling society?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the main threads throughout my new book, which you mentioned, The Education in a Time Between Worlds is the title. And basically Illich blew it away. He blew it away. And you read him now and you're like, how can it still be the way it is, given that Ivan Illich wrote this? Yeah. That one, namely Deschooling Society and Medical Nemesis.
Yeah, that one also, right.
He gets into the multi-level iatrogenic crises that plague modern industrial societies. But Deschooling Society is a remarkable book, and even more remarkable because it was written before the internet. Like many of the ideas that are within it are.
Well, I would like to say that he's a prophet of some kind. Like I put him in the category of prophet, not just thinker.
Yeah.
Totally.
Well, I mean, he was a Catholic priest, so that sense of the prophetic, and then the actual prophetic voice, that he had a prophetic voice. When you hear him speak, he has the word sound power, as the Rastas say. But there's also a way in which, because he had a religiosity, it allowed his social critique to be even deeper, that he was actually looking at evil, and not as a secularist explaining it away with evolutionary theory because we evolved to be meat machines that compete and kill. But Illich, thinking that man has an eternal soul and is yet doing this to himself, sick, him namely. And so Illich was seeing very clearly and was pulling no punches. And he saw what many people have seen with the nature of large modern school systems, which is that they are at their worst profoundly dehumanizing, and the apparatus of state control, social control, and ideological indoctrination. I mean, there's a bunch of things you can do with the school system that you couldn't do if you had a decentralized, community-based system of education where the parents basically took control of their kids, which is what it had been for a very long time. And what we know of as schools are political entities, which began with the birth of the capitalist world system. along 16th century. Now, education predates that, and other things which we'd like to call schools predate that. But what we know with the desks and the teachers and the routine and the schedule and disciplines and the preparation for entry into wage labor.
Can I just stop you? There's one thing you said. You said education predates that. But what do you mean by education then? I mean, when does education begin? Doesn't education begin with the first human in a way? I mean,
correct. I mean, you could argue that education, as I'm trying to define it, is a kind of species-specific trait. And this is like Michael Tomasello, who's at the Max Planck Institute for a while, really doing very careful research, differentiating primate behavior from human behavior, especially vis-a-vis intergenerational transmission. And of course, controversial, because when you say, well, animals don't educate one another, instantly you get the reaction, well, yes, of course they do. And I'm like, of course they do. But what happens is very, very different when a monkey shows another monkey how to do something than when an adult human enculturates a infant into toddlerhood, into early childhood. I mean, there's a qualitatively different kind of intergenerational transmission, which may or may not involve schooling, but definitely involves a ton of intimate exercise of what I call teacherly authority.
Yeah, I like that word transmission, and I think maybe that's what's missing from the education system, is a kind of transmission.
I actually think, I mean, you're correct that it's built to not do certain things, but one of the reasons it succeeds is because of the transmission of individual teachers. Like, despite the system, despite the fact that it's set up to basically dehumanize the kids and to make them into numbers and to turn them into wage laborers.
But the last kind of thing that's left is actually that.
The last thing that's left is the human on the front lines.
Transmission, sure.
Doing the right thing in the classroom, actually loving the kids. And that was my experience, where I felt completely alienated in high school as a dyslexic. And so I took to music, but I had several teachers who just loved me anyway and encouraged me anyway. And
I'm sorry if I'm too many digressions here, but I'm interested in how you did succeed as a dyslexic. Like,
I mean, it was music.
If that actually helped you succeed or something, because I wonder if our obstacles are sometimes the thing that kind of pushes us to excel a little bit further at times, even if it makes certain things kind of a struggle. Or
well, I mean, there's two ways to think about it. One is that dyslexia, it's actually just a difference. It's not a disability. Dyslexia is only a disability in a culture that involves reading, and specifically in alphabetic reading culture. In a pictographic reading culture, you don't have things like dyslexia. You have different things.
Right. I was
the
reading
idea is
that
that
book. Right.
Yeah, the idea is that you have a difference neurologically that interfaces with the culture in a particular way. And in our culture, with our alphabet and the English language in particular, and the way it's taught, dyslexia just means bad at reading. That's literally what the word means, bad at reading. Like, there's only recently that we're trying to tease apart the why are you bad at reading, and it turns out there's many forms of dyslexia. Yeah. And some of them
you've got a lot of books behind you, and you read a lot, obviously.
I read a ton, which means I'm obviously not the kind of dyslexic that struggles with reading.
So the nature of your dyslexia is something different then.
Well, I mean, so I haven't looked at the literature in a while. When I was in graduate school, I looked at it closely, and there were two kinds of dyslexia. The most important that's not true. The kind that we thought was the only kind for a long time had to do actually with phoneme and grapheme recognition, right? So can the ear parse the speech stream, right? And can you relate the parsed speech stream to the grapheme appearing on the page?
Oh, that's very interesting, yeah.
You see, and so it was actually some forms of deafness and other forms of basically auditory difference that ended up making it so that they couldn't figure out the parts of speech auditorily, and then it confused what they were doing with their eyes. Then there's another form of dyslexia, which I believe I have, which just has to do with the ratio of foveal to peripheral vision, right? Namely, that something like 80% of the people in the population have better foveal vision than peripheral vision, which is to say, like, they see better narrowly right in front of them than they do like out if you hold your arms out and wave your fingertips at the edges of your vision, like your peripheral vision. But there's some percentage of the population which actually have really good peripheral vision, and their foveal vision is kind of not great. They're actually mostly getting the gestalt and not getting the detail.
Oh, that's me. Holy cow.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I am
extraordinary.
too.
Yeah,
But
wow.
you can see obviously in some contexts, better peripheral vision would be selected for. So that's why it would still be in the system. It's only recently that we would be selecting against this. And that's one of my arguments and why I came up and into the critique of standardized testing, because it may be that dyslexics actually should be selected for. And we should build a system that doesn't select against people who actually perceive the gestalt rather than the detail. And so when I read, I actually have struggled with spelling because I don't read at the level of the grapheme or the word necessarily. I read something like at the level of the sentence or the paragraph.
That blows me away because it sounds so familiar to my experience. And I guess my next question is, what does that have to do with your interest or even my interest in music? How does that relate to music?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it's about, one way to think about what's happening here is, it's about the perception of patterns and the perception of structure and different ways of doing that. And so, I was drawn to improvisational music in particular, and music that involved very little orchestration, essentially, like Indian classical music, like Miles Davis from the Electric period, like A Bitch's Brew, and these things where you've got long 20-minute tracks with just a couple of chords set and then a ton of freeform improvisation. And my experience in that was precisely the ability to not be involved in detail at a certain level and to feel the whole thing, as opposed to planning it out in the minutia. And so I gravitated to music perhaps because I gravitated to that kind of experience.
So also you didn't gravitate to the Western classical tradition. I imagine if you're like me, it's the same thing. I could relate to Indian sounds. I could relate to African sounds. I could relate to, I could relate to psychedelic music. I could relate to jazz and all that. But I couldn't get into, Mozart or Beethoven or I only like soloists. Like I could get into Glenn Gould or something like that. But is that similar to you, or are we?
Yeah, we're similar. I mean, I played trumpet. I played trumpet since grade school, but reading music was always hard, again, because of my peripheral versus foveal vision. So I actually kind of played by ear.
I'm an illiterate musician also. Yeah. And my grandfather was an illiterate musician, and he played jazz like you wouldn't believe it. He could just jump on a piano and do Oscar Peterson.
Exactly.
But he was an illiterate musician, and I'm an illiterate musician. Yeah, I can't read at all.
Right. Well, yeah, and then of course Ornette Coleman. I mean, there's a long list.
There you go. Yeah.
Jimi Hendrix. I mean, there's a long list of musicians who couldn't read music. And then, so this is the educational question. So who do you select for, right? Who gets promoted and awarded with official musicianship status? The ones who have to read this particular kind of music, or the ones who can play almost any type of music by just perceiving the gestalt of what the whole group is doing. So yeah, but of course I came to appreciate Bach like maybe a decade ago. And so I do, appreciate Western music, but there's also this, taking it into the well-tempered scale, right? And moving out of what's called the just intonation, or the kind of given physics of Pythagorean reality, and moving it into something that can be moved across multiple pianos and actually the keys stacking. So that's another difference too. I was always drawn to Indian classical music and the blues and things that were actually
so interesting.
Attempting to kind of like question the kind of the overbearing nature of the Western structure of music itself. That's the whole blues note. When you pull the blues note down on the guitar,
Yeah, you're playing in between notes, like just like your
you're
book,
playing
like
in between
in
notes.
between worlds. So it's like in between notes.
Yeah, exactly. I played
In between worlds.
bass. I played fretless bass, and so I actually, in college, before I did anything seriously with books, I was being trained in Indian classical music on the bass, like John McLaughlin, like Shakti style, and that was amazing. And so much had to do with playing between the notes that officially exist, right?
Yeah.
The note I'm playing actually doesn't officially exist. I can't actually put it on paper, and that was gratifying to me because things that are on paper didn't seem as real as reality.
And also, you don't want to just imitate things. You want to kind of take things a step further, or step out into chaos a little bit, and then come back to order, or something like that. Yeah. Beautiful thing about that kind of music, or whereas I remember in Morocco I met a guy. He said that Moroccan music, it just goes on and on, like you can't fit it on a CD. It's a long story, and also when he hears Western music, it sounds like it has holes in it. It's like it's missing something. It's missing this in between. For him, that was his perception, right? Whereas we would hear a kind of a noise, or
so I perceive the dyslexia as an advantage, actually. Like overall, that the nervous system is different, not necessarily disabled. In certain contexts, it was a huge disadvantage, and I succeeded kind of by luck, and the grace of good teachers, I think, and then a certain kind of passion that I had, which I can't kind of like take responsibility for. It's just there, and has to do with the course that my life took. But yeah, so I did eventually read a lot of books, even though I was dyslexic, and do a lot of writing. But writing, of course, if you were to look over my shoulder when I write, you'd think, what the hell is wrong with this guy? He's like, he spells like an 8th grader. Like I can barely function at the keyboard. It takes a very long time to construct things for me.
Oh, I write really quickly, and then I write, and then I rewrite, and I write super quickly, and I make tons of mistakes, and then I go back and I fix all the mistakes. That's the only way I can do it. I don't understand people who are so fluid and could just write. For me, it's like, a kind of almost sculpting. Like at least if I'm trying to really articulate something clearly. Other times, if I've written, I wrote a book of poetry, I would just kind of, I would let the error or the mistake, remain on the page. I think there's other forms of writing where you can do that.
Right.
But so what about meditation? And I know that you've worked with Ken Wilber for a long time, and I wonder about spiritual practice, if that informs how you view all of this.
It does, definitely. Ken was a huge influence on me. His books, and then I began to work with him, myself, Mark Gaffney, him.
Mark Gaffney too, right?
Made the Center for Integral Wisdom. And, during that period, yes, I practiced Zen. I'm actually a very serious meditator, and also studied Kabbalah and Christian traditions of contemplative prayer. So that weaves in it, and I think it has to. It's part of the themes of the book about the between worldness. The between worldness is, in a sense, between definitions of sacredness, or between forms of religiosity, forms of meaning making, and even forms of legitimacy. And so there's a need to return to those both traditions and the practices they imply that might transcend any given tradition. So like Zen, for example.
I hate to say this because it sounds so ridiculous, but I also started in Zen, so we have so many things in common, it seems. I also did a lot of Zen practice when in my 20s, right? While I was reading Ivan Illich and Ken Wilber books,
Right. Ken Wilber.
I guess there's Ken Wilber's early books, had a big influence on me.
Yeah, people forget the early ones, like the Atman Project, for example. Everyone thinks of the 4 quadrants and these things, which came much, much later. He was first and foremost a transpersonal psychologist, kind of the transpersonal psychologist. And so he was, the Atman Project was written for meditators and
Yeah.
psychotherapists and people who were mostly concerned about the psyche and its transformation and salvation in that sense. Yeah, Ken was a gift in a sense to me when I encountered him, and then of course moving into Harvard and going to graduate school ended up subsuming him in a ton of other stuff. But as I say in the book, he left a deposit in my thinking that I think is something else I can't take credit for.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you were also, you said he had laudable faults. I like that phrase.
I said laudable liabilities. It was
laudable
liabilities. It was actually alliterative.
And you said at the end of your book, it was right at the end of your book that our strengths are close to our weaknesses. And I was thinking one of the things that's kind of disgusting about our culture at the moment is you take a guy like Ken Wilber and you have to have this opinion about him, like for or against, and some kind of strong dichotomous. You can't just take what is incredibly valuable there and not subscribe to everything, because we all have faults and
right. Yeah, now you're touching on the crisis of teacherly authority, right? That our culture actually doesn't know how to deal with teacherly authority. And that means it doesn't know how to be a student, because we've confused the role of student as learner with the role of student as consumer. For or against is like voting or shopping, whereas learning is much, much more complex, and teacherly authority is much more nuanced than just you take everything or leave everything. And teachers know that. Good teachers anyway. And so, yeah, you're right. It's a very difficult situation to be in as a culture when it's impossible to establish the necessary dynamics of teacherly authority that could facilitate intergenerational transmission to perpetuate civilization. So you end up getting a catastrophic bifurcation of intergenerational transmission, which looks like you don't have anything to teach me. And on the other side, I don't have anything to offer. Right.
And I was also thinking, I'm also a teacher, and I was thinking with my students that I was asked them one time, do you have any heroes? Is there anybody that you look up to or aspire to be like? And it's like, no. Like it's like it seems like in the society having somebody higher than you is an offense. Like we're all supposed to be exactly the same, or authority would mean that you would love somebody and want, even want to be them in a sense, or not to be like them, but
well, you see, if you were to expand it beyond reality, you would get them to admire certain characters and stories and TV shows and things of that nature. And so it actually has to do with the displacement into the simulation and into fantasy. It's part of the kind of late capitalist cultural industry. There's a confusion about how to receive, how to grow with the help of others. As opposed
the help they get is in the simulacrum is what you mean, like kind of like on Netflix or through watching endless dramas or
right. That's one way to view it. And then I think the difficulties compounded by the actual errors and mistakes of supposed authority. Right. So it's like if we could find a way for everyone to lose face together, as opposed to needing one party to lose face and the other party triumph. So the difficulty with the teacherly authority is that, of course, teachers are incomplete, right? Like, of course, we needed to find a way for Western culture, for example, to tell certain histories, right, about certain peoples and actions. And we need to be able to grapple with that as a culture and then see tragedy and move into something like a post-tragic form of cultural authority. Before that, we're stuck in a situation where everyone's calling on everyone else to lose face and to relinquish authority. But by whose authority? Right?
That struck me in your book as well, that idea of post tragedy. It's like the tragedy is like the postmodern era, right, where everything just gets reduced, and then the post tragedy is sort of, now that everything's broken, you're just trying to find the pieces and put them back together. And
well, yeah, I mean, and the postmodern is the kind of surfacing of the tragic. That's one way to view it. And now you can't get stuck in tragedy. You can't get stuck in just shadow work and doing endless circles and bringing up all the dark stuff. Like, that's not the goal. Like, you can't get stuck in retelling the horrors of colonialism, and you can't get stuck in, like, we need to tell these. And so it's not either or. We can't not tell them. Because then the kids get to say we're illegitimate teacherly authorities, and we would be, right? So we can't lie, and we can't avoid the truth, but we need to grapple with the tragic. We can't displace it. We can't get stuck in it either. And so that's the postmodern malaise or fragmentation or inertia, is that there's nothing beyond the tragic, right? And
that's the zombie. That's the zombie myth. I was talking to John Vervaeke about this. The zombie is the anti-tragic figure because there's no redemption for him. He just remains a zombie. There's no end to there's no end to the zombie stories. They just keep multiplying, Whereas in a real tragedy, there's a kind of catharsis you get from as you say, grappling with it, right?
Right. Yeah, no, I mean and it's not that the post-tragic is the resolution of the tragedy, or somehow when the music kicks back in and everyone's smiling and the story wraps up right.
No,
that's not the post-tragic. The post-tragic actually continues to reside in the tragic. And so in any case,
what do you mean by that? That's very interesting.
The
post-tragic continues to reside within the tragic. In other words, you're saying we can't deny the tragic. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying you absolutely can't deny the tragedy. And in fact, you can't avoid it, and you have to look square at it. I mean, death, for example.
Yeah.
Like, and this is Illich's point about that the medical system actually steals from us the art of dealing with our own suffering. And it steals from us the dignity of confronting pain and death on our own terms. And so that's an example of looking at tragedy as opposed to actually putting tragedy off onto someone else as their responsibility. Whereas death is something that we can look at every day. And in a sense, your death's a tragedy. But in another sense, once you've looked at it long enough, you realize it's the reason that you're living. And so similarly with other tragedies, if you stay in it long enough, it transforms. And so this is what we're being called to do.
It transforms into that sort of sweetness of impermanence, or
I mean, it steals into a new form of character or identity. That the tragedy is you in a certain place and time, and that the you on the other side of the tragedy is different. The alchemists talk about the kind of darkening or putrefaction or blackening, right? And that there's the dissolution and the calling up and the remembrances of the, another alchemist phrase would be something like the unendurable image, right? The unendurable image. This is a tragedy. This is the thing that you can't stand to imagine, the thought that you can't hold. But these are exactly the thought you need to hold until it changes, and until the darkening and the putrefaction allows for the emergence of something new that wouldn't have been there without it. And so, the tragic thing is often the thing that cannot be resolved and just fixed. It's the thing that needs to be served. So again, this is the issue. But if we can't get out of crises of teacherly authority and denial. So the post-truth thing goes both ways, right? The post-truth thing both denies the tragedy's happened, and on the other side, denies that there's a way out of tragedy, right? And which is to say, there needs to be truth for there to be a way out of tragedy, right? And there needs to be legitimacy, authentic authority, things like morality and ethics that matter. These
like
things
a
need to exist.
narrative, like a, because postmodernism is the death of all narratives. But
Right.
so you kind of refine the golden thread of the narrative.
Right. Yeah. The golden thread of the narrative, and the ability again to for everyone to lose face together. Like, what does that language even look like? Do we have that language? It's not everyone's off the hook together. That's not the solution. It's, can everyone lose face together? Like, what does that language even look like for that? And who right now, when I said that's like, oh, not me, not my group.
Well, the word that came to mind when you said that was atonement or something.
Yeah, atonement's a good word.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. So I don't know how exactly we got to this point, but
the next
now we're in pretty deep.
yeah, we're in pretty deep. Yeah, I tend to skip formalities and things like this in this podcast because of some of the frustration you spoke of with the kind of form of a podcast. So anyway, the next place that this leads to is you have this idea of concrete utopia. So we have tragedy, and then we have post-tragedy, and now we have concrete utopia. Do you want to get into that and your 13 utopias? Or
totally, yeah, the 13 social miracles as a form of concrete utopian theorizing. Yeah, I mean, obviously the word utopia, we can trace it, and it's a pejorative at this point. Utopia,
right? Exactly. That's why I wanted you to.
And it's interesting because I've been doing a lot of work studying like the 30 Years' War in Europe and the secret societies within that ushered us through from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. There was this dicey period with the Inquisitions and the 30 Years' War, which is kind of the First World War. And this figure, John Amos Comenius, who's the greatest educational reformer who've ever lived, who no one's ever heard of. And he basically was working right after Bacon, right? And so right after the first utopians wrote their utopias. And so he took the utopian scheme, which ended up being kind of like infused with a certain Rosicrucian essence, and then began to go around Europe talking to all the kings, convincing them to make the utopia concrete. Comenius was actually one of the first concrete utopian theorists in history, living in the 1600s, basically turning specifically More's Utopia, Solomon's Temple within it, the educational affordances of like a full stack technological society. It's fascinating stuff. And so the idea of the concrete utopia is that you find a way to exercise the imagination, like the social imagination, in a much, much more radical way, based on something that looks like utopian theorizing, based on like principles, right? Based on ideals. And then you begin to try to relate it directly to what's actually existing, right? And so it's kind of the only way to do critical theory if you actually think about it. Like a woman named Ben Habib, I think, wrote a book called Critique and Utopia, I think it was called. He looks at Habermas and all the critical theorists and basically saying, if you look at critical theory, there's always the utopian moment and the diagnostic moment. There's always the moment of critique, and there's always the moment of laying out the vision of what could be better. Now, often the vision of what could be better is implicit. It's crypto, you never say it. You just critiquing. But implicit in the critique is that there's some way that it might not be that way, right? That there's some way that's not bad. So there's always the utopian moment in any kind of step of criticism. So the concrete utopians end up doing that work where they're actually suggesting it in almost an insane way. They're almost kind of like saying, hey, wait, have you stopped and slowed down? Actually, look at this. We could do it very, very differently. Let's use a couple thought experiments that seem utopian to begin to spark the imagination to get us thinking about what to actually do on the ground. Right? Yeah. And so Roy Bhaskar was where I got the actual term from, concrete utopian theorizing, because he was so, kind of disgruntled with the crypto normativism of postmodernism, which is to say the critique, always implying that there is an actual better way, but never stating the better way.
Yeah.
Because if you state the better way, then now you're open to critique.
Uh-huh.
But if you just critique, and then have a crypto-normativism,
Uh-huh.
which you smuggle in the utopian moment behind the scenes and never talk about it.
Interesting.
And so Bhaskar started doing basically a kind of like concrete utopian theorizing to kind of counteract the overtly and pessimistic and nihilistic kind of critiques of the postmodernists. So I kind of take that up with the 13 social miracles and basically run a set of thought experiments, which are concrete utopian thought experiments, which are in one sense naive, but in another sense close enough to actual reality to be provocative and to be, in a sense, not a political platform, but a disciplined way of thinking about futures. So that.
Well, in other words, you have something to aim for, right?
Yeah, in a simple sense, you have something to aim for, and
otherwise, you're just going to spin around in nihilism.
Correct, but it's also that you're making explicit, like it's a coming to terms with what you need to imagine to actually get there.
Yeah.
Right. Like if we need to step out of the languages of critique and get into the languages of commitment, let's say, right, then we need to actually play a different kind of language game where we're no longer yelling at one another about how we suck and actually collaborating on what we might build together that would be preferable.
Yeah. And that's also traditional in a way too, because that's the promised land or the city on the hill, or, you know.
Correct. Yeah, we've always lived in that.
And
yeah.
We always have to have that as a framework of you know, where we need to go or something like that.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, that's, you know, there's a great book, I can't remember the guy, but it's called The Image of the Future. And basically it's this note, and he tracks it all the way through the anciency of like, we've always had these profound images of what the human will become, basically. And they used to be apocalyptic and very dramatic, and or they weren't, but you know, we've lost that. We, in a sense, and I've said this somewhere, like, you know, capitalism can't imagine its own infinity, which is to say, like, there's a limit to the imagination of what we can conceive right now is possible socially, because of the habituation to the current civilization. And so that's the other thing that concrete utopian theorizing is doing. It's disrupting habitual thought pattern, or at least attempting to. And again, it's not novel. You know, I think a lot of science fiction tries to do this. Usually we get dystopian science fiction, but usually in the dystopian science fiction, there's like a couple images of a utopian kind of setup. So there's the possibility to begin to restructure the social imagination by doing concrete utopian theorizing on scale and in popular culture, as opposed to having zombie movies, having movies that portray a near future scenario that's extremely realistic where things start going well. And you show what the technology applications could actually look like and how things could be different with medicine and education, and show a world that's actually working, that's close enough to this world that it actually ends up being very critical of this world.
It's like, funny, like I think around 2000, or, you know, around the time Trump was elected, you could say, I started, even though like this was a kind of traumatic moment for everybody on some level, but this was also the moment, and I'm not saying Trump's a great guy or anything like that. I'm saying this was kind of the moment, I think, of where I started to think that, okay, everything's falling apart. So then this is the moment where a constructive new purposing could occur, right? And then I started coming up, finding people like Alexander Bard, who was talking about the ecotopia, and that being a constructive concept, and talking about just constructive concepts, right? And I hadn't even considered that there would be constructive concepts. Like, it's just like, because, you know, it would be just, I would just be in the woods doing tantric Buddhist practice, and that would be it. But in the general culture, I think I didn't think anything was going on, right? And now I have this slight feeling that like something's going on, and you're talking about it, and other people are talking about it, that there's actually something going on.
Right. No, and the comparison to that, to the 30 Years' War and that shift in the world system with the Comenian conquered utopian vision and that being held together with kind of a bunch of constructive theorizing happening behind the scenes. This is what's happening now. We're transitioning. The whole civilization is transitioning.
Right. Yeah.
Or it's ending.
Certainly.
Or it's ending.
Or it's ending. Yeah, sure.
Right.
Sure.
And
that's always a possibility you need to keep in your mind as well, right? Both of those things, you know.
Well, and they're both true. Like if something new does emerge, then this civilization ends. If something new doesn't emerge, this civilization also ends. Now it's two different ways of ending the civilization. And there is a sense that when things start to break apart, then you get new possibilities, new light shining through. That is precisely because we don't have one hegemonic narrative anymore, that we're getting a lot of people triangulating truths from different angles that never would have been seen because of the dominance of the one narrative. Now, the complete absence of narrative is starting to become a problem.
Sure.
But again, we're between worlds, and being between worlds means that there is an absence of coherent narrative. And
well, maybe
how could it be otherwise, given the scope of planetization in the past century, right? That this is a phase-specific, developmentally appropriate, like transition of humanization, planetization. As Girard wrote, as Aurobindo wrote, as Jeffrey West writes, as is obvious. But we're still out to kill one another over soil and the color of our skin. So the question is not learning. Learning takes care of itself. The question is, why aren't we learning? The question is, as Habermas once said, it's not learning, it's not learning. That's the question.
I see.
You see? Like, what's
why
the
after
stagnation?
How many thousand years we're still sort of stuck in this, let's say, rivalrous mode, where we again, I read Rene Girard recently, and he talks about the scapegoat, and there's always this need for a scapegoat.
I mean, Girard is in the air. You know, Girard is in the air.
Everybody's talking about Girard because I think Girard, like Ivan Illich. I'd like to hear people talking more about Ivan Illich. These are thinkers that sort of spoke before their time and are now extremely important, it seems to me.
Totally. And Girard, I think, is, again, he's misunderstood and smuggled into the cynical nihilistic narrative, when in fact Girard is a Christian. The way you end scapegoating is by imitating Christ. You know, that Christ taught us to stop this scapegoating shit. And the scapegoat always returns as the savior, or the thing that that actually coheres the community. And so people misread Girard as saying, almost like an evolutionary biologist, that we're stuck in mimetic violence and that we're stuck in competition, right? That's what they read him as. Well, like, we evolved and the humans are the tragic creatures that are stuck in the scapegoat dynamics. Humans are the tragic meat machines that are stuck in the rivalrous game. When actually he's saying, we could be, but Jesus, but Jesus, religion.
Well, and he's saying that there's sort of a progressive unfolding of the truth going on.
Correct.
At the same time as all of this terrible corruption.
Yeah, totally. And as a developmental psychologist, it seems clear that there are certain levels of development when forms of mimetic violence and imitation lock in, but there are post-conventional forms of identity development where the idea that the motivation for your behavior would be entirely mimetic is actually absurd. And so there's not a cap. There appears to be a cap on the Girardian development, that everyone is stuck, like, on Facebook in mimetic violence, and that's why it's designed that way. By the way, because of the connection with Thiel and Girard. But the deeper story is actually no. Girard himself says there's a way out of this dynamic of mimetic violence, which leads to scapegoating and those types of
so the way out, even if you weren't a Christian, would still be the Messiah, or in some sense.
Well, and the Messiah technically means in Hebrew the raising or the changing of conversation.
Yes.
And so you're correct that the way out, even if you're not a Christian, is to move into post-conventional forms of more autonomous and sovereign identity, which would allow you to not imitate violence when you see it, but to make yourself subject to it in order to stop it. And so this is the lesson of Christ. And again, it's about staying in the tragedy, not avoiding the tragedy. Scapegoat dynamic is about avoiding the tragedy. Whereas as Girard reads,
massive collective denial of some kind. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so again, it's interesting that I think Girard is read into as the cynical narrative, when I actually read him as a kind of a Christian mystic almost. Like if you take it seriously enough and see the way that he was getting into myth.
No, I agree with you. Well, I think if you read him correctly, it's good news, right?
Kind of.
In a way, it's the worst kind of. It's the worst kind of good news, but it's still good news, right?
Yeah, if getting nailed to the cross is good news, then that's good news.
Well, the ego has to be crucified, and perhaps you could think of it that way, or is that too?
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's a good way to think about it when you think about the demands of consolidating identity at the post-conventional levels. Yeah. It's as Maslow said about the self-transcending, that it's the altar on which you sacrifice your ego. Not the means by which you gratify your ego, but the altar on which you sacrifice it. Means it's not the thing you think it is often, where you find the self-transcendence and actual maturity.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Yeah.